One result of our country's experiment with prohibition in the 1920s was the rise of criminal gangs. Among the most infamous and violent was Al Capone's. While he avoided prosecution for the many murders and other crimes he and his gang committed, he was eventually prosecuted for what today is called white-collar crime. Here with that story is my colleague, Bob Fagan.
During the late 1920s, law enforcement agencies struggled to convict Al Capone, notorious head of the Chicago underworld, for countless murders and other illegal activities. Named public enemy number one by the Chicago Crime Commission, Capone easily evaded prosecution through bribery and intimidation. By 1928, it was estimated that Capone's organization made over $100 million from various illicit rackets, including bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. In Washington, D.C., frustration with the failure to convict America's #1 gangster mounted after the election of President Herbert Hoover. "Have you got that fellow Capone yet?" became Hoover's daily refrain. The federal government couldn't go after Capone for murder or other state crimes, but income tax evasion was a federal offense. A group of special Internal Revenue agents was put on the case to dig up information proving that Capone had knowingly and willfully evaded paying his income taxes. On learning of the investigation, Capone was overheard to say, "The income tax law is a lot of bunk. The government can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." And he would have been right a few years earlier. But in 1928, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the bootlegger who had not filed tax returns for that reason. The court could find no reason why the fact that a business is unlawful should exempt it from paying taxes that, if lawful, it would have to pay. Because of that ruling, Al Capone could be prosecuted for tax evasion. After more than 2 years of hard digging and promises of protection for witnesses, in June 1931, the Internal Revenue Unit presented enough evidence to get a grand jury in the Northern District of Illinois to indict Capone. The indictment charged that he owed $219,000 in back taxes for the years 1924 to 1929. Facing a possible 34 years in prison, Capone offered to plead guilty in exchange for a light sentence. U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson recommended a sentence of 2.5 years and a fine of several $100,000 to U.S. District Judge James Wilkerson. Capone was stunned a few weeks later when Wilkerson rejected the recommendation, stating, "It's time for somebody to impress upon the defendant that it is utterly impossible to bargain with a federal court." He permitted Capone to withdraw his guilty plea and set trial for 2 months later. During those months, the mob boss managed to get a list of jury panel members for his case and set out to bribe or intimidate them. But Capone was in for another surprise. The prosecution found out about the jury tampering and told Judge Wilkerson. The judge assured a worried Johnson, "Bring your case into court as planned. Leave the rest to me." On October 6, 1931, crowds of spectators gathered to see Capone as he arrived for trial, exuding confidence. He soon realized, however, that the judge had foiled him by switching jury panels with another judge at the last minute. The 12 jurors selected that day were from a rural area. They included 3 grocers, a hardware merchant, and a farmer. The jury was sequestered to protect members from any tampering. The government had to prove that Capone had earned taxable income during at least one of the years named in the indictment. The prosecutors called dozens of witnesses to testify about the huge sums of money the gangster spent. Finally, the government presented a letter written by Capone's lawyer seeking a compromise of the income tax claims. It admitted that he had income of more than $200,000 during the relevant period and had paid no tax on it. His attorneys argued strenuously that the letter couldn't be used as evidence against the defendant, but in a devastating blow, the judge ruled against them. The only defense left to Capone was to argue that he had gambled all his money away at the racetrack. In closing argument, defense counsel contended that the prosecution had only proved that Capone was a spendthrift. After less than 9 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Capone was guilty on 5 of the 23 counts. Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years imprisonment and a fine of $50,000. Prosecutor Johnson credited the absolute unreachability of the federal courts for his success. "I cannot too emphatically praise the high caliber of the federal judges," he said. Capone was among the first group of inmates sent to Alcatraz, the new maximum security federal prison in San Francisco Bay. He was released in 1939, a sick and broken man. In 1947, the brutal mob boss, who violently murdered so many of his rivals, died quietly at his home with his family around him. He was 48 years old. That's a moment in court history. I'll be back with another in a future